Sunday morning in Lexington began with the ringing of bells from the Baptist Church on Nicholasville Road. At 8:47 a.m., Reverend David Clark stood in front of the mirror in his office, adjusting his dark blue tie. At 45, he was still an imposing figure, broad shoulders, graying temples that only added to his authority, and piercing blue eyes that were equally adept at comforting the bereaved and instilling reverence in sinners. "David, everyone's gathering." His wife Dorothy peeked into the office, holding a stack of Sunday service programs. At 42, she looked younger. Her chestnut hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and she wore a modest gray dress that couldn't hide her natural beauty. A primary school teacher, she was loved by the children and their parents for her patience and kindness. "Just a minute," David replied, not looking up from the mirror. "Today's a special sermon. It's about the importance of family ties." Dorothy froze in the doorway. Something in her husband's tone made her tense, but she just nodded and left. In recent months, an invisible wall had grown between them. David had become more demanding, controlling her every move, every conversation, every smile she gave to the congregation. About 300 people were already gathering in the main hall of the church. The Lexington Baptist congregation was one of the largest in the city, and David was proud of that. He had built his reputation on charismatic sermons and his ability to connect with every parishioner. City officials consulted him on social issues, and the local press regularly quoted his opinions on morality and family values. "Welcome, Brother Michael." The pastor greeted the man warmly as he entered through the main door. Michael Thompson was a year younger than David, but he looked older. Life as the owner of a small hardware store on University Drive had left its mark of fatigue and disappointment on his face. His divorce 2 years ago had hit him hard, especially when his ex-wife moved to Nashville, taking their 2 children, a 10-year-old son and an 8-year-old daughter with her. "Hi, Dave. Dorothy." He nodded slightly to the pastor's wife, who was handing out programs at the entrance. Their eyes met for a moment longer than politeness required. David and Michael's friendship began in childhood when they were neighbors in a working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of Lexington. They played baseball together, went to Sunday school together, and dreamed of the future together. But life took them down different paths. David entered the seminary, married Dorothy right after she graduated from Teachers College, and built a successful career as a spiritual leader. Michael stayed in his hometown, took out a loan to open a store, married a local girl who eventually couldn't handle the financial difficulties, and left him for a more successful man. "How's the store?" David asked, putting his hand on his friend's shoulder. "We're surviving. The new supermarket on Harrodsburg Road is taking away our customers, but we're hanging in there." Michael shrugged. He didn't mention that he was thinking about selling the business, nor did he mention that for the past 3 months he had been staying late after work when Dorothy walked past his store after school. It all started by chance. In October, Dorothy's classroom faucet broke, and she stopped by Michael's shop for tools. They talked for half an hour about school, the kids, and life in the city. It was just small talk, but for both of them, it was a breath of fresh air. Dorothy hadn't met a man in a long time who listened to her so attentively, without interrupting or giving advice. Michael, for the first time in a long time, felt that a woman was interested in him not as a potential provider, but as a person. Their meetings became regular. Dorothy would come up with reasons to stop by the store. Sometimes she needed a light bulb for the classroom, sometimes nails for a school project. Michael started staying at work until 6, knowing that was when she was passing by on her way home. They discussed books. It turned out they had similar literary tastes. They talked about trips they would like to take. Michael told her about the children he only saw on weekends, and Dorothy told her about her students, who were like the children she never had with David. "Brothers and sisters." The pastor's voice interrupted Michael's thoughts. The service had begun. "Today I want to talk to you about the sacred bonds of marriage, about fidelity and betrayal." Dorothy, sitting in the front row as befitted the pastor's wife, felt nausea rising in her throat. David looked straight at her as he spoke about how betrayal destroys not only families, but entire communities. "When a woman breaks her vow of fidelity," he continued, his voice growing firmer, "she is not just deceiving her husband. She is betraying God, who blessed their union." The hall was completely silent. The congregation listened intently to their pastor, unaware of the subtext of his words. But Dorothy understood. Michael, who was sitting in the middle of the hall, understood too, and felt cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. What about a man who can't give his wife love and understanding? The thought flashed through Dorothy's mind, but she didn't dare say it out loud. In 20 years of marriage, David had turned from a romantic seminarian into a cold, calculating man for whom his wife was part of his image as a successful pastor, not a living person with her own needs and desires. After the service, the parishioners gathered in the church hall for coffee and light refreshments, as was customary. Dorothy stood next to her husband, smiling and accepting congratulations on his wonderful sermon. Inside, she felt sickened by the hypocrisy of it all. Mrs. Clark, an elderly woman in a colorful dress, approached her. "How do you manage to look so beautiful? A happy marriage must be the best recipe for beauty." "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson," Dorothy smiled stiffly. "The main thing is to find what brings you joy in life." Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Michael standing by the far wall, holding an untouched cup of coffee. Their eyes met across the room, and there was more understanding and warmth in that glance than in 20 years of marriage to David. "Honey," her husband's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Wilson wanted to talk to you about a school project." The rest of the day passed in the usual routine. David held individual consultations with parishioners. Dorothy prepared dinner and checked school notebooks. By evening, when they were alone in their home in the Hamptons, the tension was palpable. "That was an interesting sermon you gave today," Dorothy said as she set the table. "Do you think so?" David didn't look up from the newspaper. "I thought some people in the congregation looked uncomfortable. Perhaps because condemnation rarely leads to repentance." "What does?" He looked directly at her. Dorothy set the plate down a little harder than necessary. "Understanding, forgiveness, love. Love must be earned, or unconditional. Isn't that what Christ taught?" David folded the newspaper and looked intently at his wife. Over the years of their marriage, he had learned to read her moods, and now something in her behavior was causing him concern. Dorothy had become more independent, more likely to express her own opinions, less likely to agree with his decisions. Just a few months ago, she would never have argued with him about matters of faith. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Of course, just tired. I have a math test tomorrow in 3rd grade." But they both knew it wasn't about the test. Something had changed in their relationship, and that change was gathering momentum like a snowball rolling down a mountain. That night, Dorothy lay awake, staring at the ceiling. David was sleeping next to her, and even in his sleep, his face looked stern and disapproving. She thought about Michael, about their conversations, about how he laughed at her jokes, how attentively he listened to her stories about school. With him, she felt alive, interesting, desired. With her husband, she was just a functional part of his ideal image. A few miles from the Clark's house, Michael also couldn't sleep. He knew he was crossing a dangerous line by falling in love with his best friend's wife, but it was too late to stop. Dorothy had become the light at the end of the tunnel for him, the hope that life could be different, that he could be happy. In her office at the church, Detective Lisa Hernandez was reviewing files on a drug trafficking case that had brought her from Louisville to Lexington a month ago. The 38-year-old investigator with 15 years of experience was known for her meticulousness and unwillingness to take anything at face value. Soon her path would cross that of the Clarks, but for now she knew the pastor only by reputation, as an influential religious figure whose opinion was respected in the town. Monday began as usual for Dorothy. At 7:15, she was standing in front of the mirror in her bedroom, braiding her hair, when David entered the room, already fully dressed. "I'll be late today," he said, adjusting his tie. "City council meeting about the new homeless shelter, then consultations until 9. "Okay," Dorothy replied without turning to him. In the mirror, she could see him studying her face, looking for some sign of what? Deception? Guilt? "By the way," David paused in the doorway, "Michael called late last night. He asked about you. He said you looked upset after work." Dorothy's heart skipped a beat. "He's just worried. We're old friends." "Yes, old friends." David paused. "I just don't remember him paying so much attention to you before." After her husband left, Dorothy sat down on the edge of the bed and covered her face with her hands. She knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't stop. Over the past 2 months, Michael had become the only bright spot in her gray life. At school, Brian's Stations Day went as usual: math, reading, and art with the third graders. But Dorothy's thoughts kept returning to Michael's gaze across the church hall yesterday, to his eyes full of understanding and warmth. "Mrs. Clark, are you all right? You seem distracted today," asked her colleague Susan Miller during lunch break. "I just didn't sleep well," Dorothy lied, stirring her coffee. It must be hard being a pastor's wife, always in the spotlight, having to set an example. Susan had been divorced for 5 years and made no secret of the fact that she found church life too restrictive. "Sometimes," Dorothy admitted quietly. "Have you ever thought you might be happier with someone else?" The question came so unexpectedly that Dorothy choked on her coffee. "Susan, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be tactless. It's just that sometimes I get the impression that you're not very happy." Dorothy didn't answer, but deep down she knew her colleague was right. At 4:20 p.m., when the school was empty, Dorothy gathered her things and headed for the exit. On her way home, she had to pass Michael's shop, and her heart began to beat faster. She hadn't planned on going in, but the shop door opened with a melodious jingle. Michael was standing behind the counter sorting bills, and when he saw her, his face lit up with a smile. "Hi, Dorothy. How's school?" "Fine. How are you?" She moved closer, feeling the familiar excitement. "Better now?" He put down his papers. "Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." She should have said no and gone home. Instead, she nodded. They sat in the small office behind the store, drinking coffee and talking about this and that, the weather, the local news, the book Dorothy was reading to the children. But beneath the surface chatter, something deeper was stirring, a mutual attraction that was growing stronger every day. "Dorothy," Michael finally said, "I need to tell you something." "What?" She felt her breath catch. "I think about you all the time. I know I shouldn't, I know it's wrong, but I can't stop." The silence lasted forever. Dorothy stared into her cup, struggling with herself. "Michael, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said anything. You're married. David is my best friend. I think about you too," she interrupted, and those words sounded like a confession of the worst sin imaginable. He reached out and covered her hand with his. It was a simple touch, but for both of them, it was a turning point. "What should we do?" Dorothy whispered. "I don't know, but I can't pretend there's nothing between us." Meanwhile, at Lexington Police Headquarters, Detective Lisa Hernandez was studying testimony in a drug trafficking case. A tall, slender woman with a sharp mind and piercing dark eyes, she was used to her male colleagues underestimating her abilities. In her 15 years on the force, she had learned to use this to her advantage. "Hernandez," Sergeant Davis called out, "you have a visitor." Standing in the doorway was Reverend David Clark himself. Lisa knew him from photos in the local newspaper, an influential religious leader whose opinion carried weight with the city council. "Detective Hernandez, David Clark, I have some information that may help your investigation." Lisa gestured to the chair across from her desk. The pastor sat down, carefully smoothing his pants. "I'm listening, Reverend." "One of my parishioners told me about suspicious activity near the warehouses on New Circle Road. People coming and going at odd hours, cars with no license plates." For the next 20 minutes, David recounted information that could indeed prove useful. Lisa took notes, but at the same time studied the man in front of her. Something about his demeanor, his overly controlled gestures, made her wary. Over the years, she had learned to sense when people were hiding something. "Thank you for your help, Reverend. We will definitely look into this." "Always happy to help law enforcement. Our community must be free of drugs and other vices. It must be difficult to uphold moral standards in today's world," Lisa remarked. Something flashed in David's eyes, tension, anger, but it was gone in an instant. It's not easy, especially when evil creeps up unnoticed, hiding behind a mask of innocence. After the pastor left, Lisa thought about that phrase for a long time. By 7 o'clock, Dorothy finally got home. David wasn't there yet. He was indeed late for his meetings. She made dinner, did the laundry, checked the notebooks, but her thoughts kept returning to her conversation with Michael. The phone rang at 8:30. "Hello?" Dorothy answered. "It's me." Michael's voice sounded tense. "Dorothy, I need to see you." "Michael, we can't." "Please, let's meet somewhere neutral. Jacobs Park on Lansdowne Drive in half an hour." Dorothy looked at her watch. David wouldn't be back before 9:30. "Okay, but not for long." The park was almost empty. Just a couple of teenagers on a bench by the pond and an elderly man walking his dog. Michael was waiting for her by a large oak tree. "Thanks for coming," he said when she approached. "Michael, I don't know if we're doing the right thing. I've been thinking all day about what I said to you, and I realized I can't keep pretending." He stepped closer, and Dorothy smelled his familiar cologne and felt the warmth of his body. "Dorothy, I'm in love with you. I know I don't have the right. I know it complicates everything, but I can't keep quiet anymore." The words she had both feared and waited for. "Michael, do you feel the same way I do?" She closed her eyes. "Yes, but what could ever come of this? I'm married. David is your best friend. If this ever comes out, what if it doesn't? Are you asking me to cheat on my husband? I'm asking you to be happy." They stood so close that they could feel each other's breath. One step, and their lips would have met in a kiss that would have changed everything. But at that moment, Dorothy's phone rang. "David." She read the name on the display. "Hello? Where are you?" Her husband's voice was cold. "At the store. I forgot to buy milk." "That's strange. I just drove past Kroger and didn't see your car there." Dorothy felt the ground slip away beneath her feet. "I'm at a small shop on Larchmont. It's cheaper there." "Okay. See you at home." The connection was cut off. Michael saw the panic in her eyes. "Does he suspect anything?" "I don't know. I have to go." She headed for the car, but he caught up with her. "Dorothy, wait. We can't leave things as they are. What can we change?" Her voice sounded desperate. "Michael, I can't lose everything. My job, my reputation, the life I've built for 20 years. Can you lose the chance to be happy?" The question hung in the air without an answer. Dorothy arrived home at 9:45 with a carton of milk she had bought at the convenience store. David was sitting in the living room with a Bible on his lap, but she knew he wasn't reading. He was waiting. "Sorry I'm late," she said, placing the carton on the kitchen table. "It's okay. How was school?" "Fine, just the usual." "What did you do after work?" The question sounded too casual to be accidental. "I checked my notebooks and prepared materials for tomorrow's lessons. How was your meeting?" "Productive. By the way, I stopped by the police station. I met Detective Hernandez, the one investigating the drug case. She's an interesting woman, very observant." Dorothy nodded, not understanding where he was going with this. She said that the most important thing in their work is attention to detail. People think they can hide the truth, but sooner or later it always comes out. "Probably." "Dorothy?" He looked up from the Bible. "If you had any problems, would you tell me?" "Of course," she lied. That night, Dorothy lay awake listening to her husband's steady breathing and thinking about how the life she knew was falling apart. On the one hand, there was David with his growing suspicions and control. On the other, there was Michael with his love and his promise of happiness, which could cost her everything. Meanwhile, in his apartment on South Ashland, Michael sat in the kitchen, holding a photo of his children and realizing that he had fallen in love with a woman he could never have without destroying everyone around him, including himself. Detective Lisa Hernandez, meanwhile, was analyzing the information she had received from Reverend Clark. The data was accurate. Something suspicious was indeed going on at the warehouses, but something about the pastor's manner of presenting the information continued to bother her. He seemed too eager to portray himself as a fighter for justice. Over the years, Lisa had learned that when people were overly eager to demonstrate their righteousness, they usually had something to hide. Wednesday, November 15th, began with an unexpected snowfall, the first of the season. Dorothy stood at the kitchen window, watching large flakes cover the yard of their home in the Hamptons. At the table, David was reading the morning news on his tablet. occasionally looking up to follow his wife's every move. "Is it parent-teacher conference today?" he asked, without looking up from the screen. "Yes, at 7 o'clock. Dorothy poured herself some coffee, trying not to let the cup shake in her hands. "Okay, I'll be free then too. I'll drive you to school and pick you up afterward." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a decision. Over the past week, David had insisted on driving her to work and picking her up. Officially, it was for her safety in the winter weather. In reality, it was so he could control her every move. "Thanks, but I have a car," Dorothy tried to object. "In this weather? No, dear. I can't let you take any chances." David got up from the table and walked over to her. He put his hands on her shoulders, a gesture that might have looked tender to an outsider, but his fingers were clenching her shoulders too tightly. "You know how worried I am about your safety?" After breakfast, David did drive her to school. On the way, he talked about his plans for the weekend and upcoming church events, but Dorothy could sense him watching her reactions. "By the way," he said, stopping the car at the school entrance, "Michael called late last night. He asked if we needed any help with the church roof repairs." Dorothy felt her heart sink. "And what did you say?" "That we're managing on our own for now. It's strange, though. He usually comes to me directly about things like that, not through you." "Through me?" "Yes. He said you mentioned the roof problems." Dorothy realized she was trapped. She had never spoken to Michael about the church roof. He must have been mistaken, or maybe I forgot. David nodded, but his eyes remained cold. Probably. The day at school dragged on agonizingly slowly. Dorothy tried to concentrate on her lessons, but her thoughts kept returning to the morning's conversation. David was clearly suspicious, perhaps even more than he was letting on. And why had Michael called home? That was extremely careless. During lunch break, she couldn't resist and dialed Michael's store number. "Thompson's Hardware," a familiar voice answered. "Michael, it's me." "Dorothy, what's wrong? You sound worried." "Why did you call home yesterday?" Pause. "I wanted to hear your voice. I'm sorry, I know it was stupid." "Michael, David is suspicious. He's asking strange questions and watching my every move. Maybe we should stop. I don't want to put you in danger. And I don't want to lose the only good thing in my life," she whispered into the receiver. "Dorothy, I have to go. Talk to you later." She hung up without waiting for a response. Meanwhile, in the hardware store office, Michael put down the phone and realized that the situation was getting out of control. Over the past month, he had caught himself several times driving to Dorothy's school just to see her in the window. Last night, in a fit of desperation, he had actually called the Clark's house under a false pretext. He knew he was playing with fire, but he couldn't stop himself. The doorbell rang. David Clark himself walked in. "Hi, Mike," the pastor smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Dave, I didn't expect to see you. How's it going?" "Not bad. I thought I'd drop by to thank you for offering to help with the church roof." Michael felt the blood drain from his face. "What roof?" "You called yesterday. You said Dorothy mentioned there were problems with the roof." "Oh yes, of course." Michael tried to remain calm. Always happy to help the community. David slowly walked between the shelves looking at the merchandise. "You know, Mike, it seems to me that you've become more interested in church matters lately. I'm trying to be more active in the community. And Dorothy, she mentioned that you often ask about her work at the school. We're old friends. Naturally, I'm interested in how she's doing." David stopped in front of the counter and looked Michael straight in the eye. "Friends. Yes, we're all old friends. But you know what I've noticed? Sometimes friendship can cross boundaries." "What do you mean?" "Nothing specific, just an observation." David turned toward the exit but stopped at the door. "By the way, Mike, do you remember the commandment, 'Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife'?" The question hung in the air like a punch. Michael felt his heart pounding in his chest. "Of course I do. Wise words. Coveting what belongs to others always leads to destruction." David left, leaving Michael in a state close to panic. At police headquarters, Detective Lisa Hernandez was studying the results of the raid on the warehouses, information about which had been provided by Reverend Clark. The operation had been successful. 3 drug dealers had been arrested, and a large consignment of heroin seized. But something continued to bother Lisa. "Hernandez," her colleague Jim Ruskin called out to her. "Your informant from the church is here again." David Clark stood in the reception area, holding another folder of documents. "Detective, I have some additional information on your case." Lisa invited him into her office. This time, the pastor had brought photographs that he said had been taken by one of his parishioners. "How did your parishioner happen to be in that neighborhood with a camera at just the right time?" Lisa asked. "He works as a security guard in the building next door. He noticed some suspicious activity and decided to document it." The explanation sounded reasonable, but Lisa sensed something was off. Over the years, she had learned to recognize when people were telling a story that was too convenient. "Reverend, may I ask you a personal question?" "Of course. Do you have a family?" Something changed in David's expression. "Yes, my wife Dorothy. We've been married for 20 years. "Children?" "Number the Lord has not blessed us with children." There was a note of sadness in his voice. It must be hard for a pastor's wife, always in the public eye, having to live up to expectations. "Dorothy does a wonderful job." Interesting wording, Lisa thought. Duties, not joys or calling. "Does she have any interests of her own? Hobbies? Friends?" David tensed. "Is that relevant to your investigation?" "Sorry, professional habit. I'm interested in people. Dorothy is a teacher. Her work and the church are her life." He stood up. "If there are no further questions regarding the case, of course, thanks for your help." After the pastor left, Lisa wrote in her notebook, "Clark, family problems? Overly protective of information about his wife." By 6 o'clock, the snow had intensified. David arrived at Dorothy's school at the appointed time. He was silent on the way home, which only increased her anxiety. "How was your day?" she asked, trying to break the silence. "Productive. I stopped by Michael's store." Dorothy felt her breath catch. "Why?" "To thank him for offering to help with the roof. We had an interesting conversation." "About what?" David stopped the car at a red light and turned to her. "About friendship, about boundaries, about how some people forget their place." "David, I don't understand what you're getting at." "You don't understand?" He smiled. "Dorothy, we've been married for 20 years. You think I don't see what's going on with you?" The traffic light turned green and he started driving again. "What's going on with me?" "You've changed. You've become distracted, secretive. You stay late at work, you make up excuses to leave the house, and it all started around the time Michael started showing such an interest in you." Dorothy realized there was no point in denying it. "David, there's nothing going on between us. For now." They drove home in complete silence. At dinner, David talked about church matters and made plans for the following Sunday, but Dorothy sensed that this was the calm before the storm. At 8:30, the phone rang. Dorothy reached for the receiver, but David beat her to it. "The Clarks," he answered. He listened. "Michael, why do you need Dorothy?" Dorothy closed her eyes. It was over. "I see. No, she's busy. Anyway, Mike, I think you should solve your problems on your own without involving my wife." He hung up and looked at Dorothy. He said he was calling about the school charity fair. He wanted to ask about a donation. David spoke calmly, but his eyes flashed with anger. It's strange that a shop owner would consult a teacher instead of the school principal. Maybe he's just... Enough. David's voice became harsh. "Dorothy, I'm not an idiot. I can see what's going on." "What do you see?" "I see my wife falling in love with my best friend." The words sounded like a sentence. Dorothy felt everything she had tried to hide crumble. "David. 20 years, Dorothy. 20 years I've built our life, our reputation, our place in this community. And you're willing to destroy it all for what? For a week of romantic fantasies." "These aren't fantasies." The confession came out on its own. David turned pale. "So you really are?" "I'm unhappy, David. I have been for many years. You're not my husband. You're my boss, my controller, my jailer. I'm protecting us. Our family, our service." "What service? You only serve your pride and ambition." David stood up from the table so abruptly that he knocked over a chair. "Enough. No, not enough. I have a right to happiness. You have the right to be faithful to your husband." And you have the right to love your wife, not use her as a prop for your career." They stood in the kitchen, shouting at each other, 20 years of pent-up resentment pouring out. "If you're so unhappy," David finally said in an icy tone, "you can leave. But know this, if you choose Michael, you'll lose everything. Your job, your reputation, your respect, and you'll lose him too, because when the scandal breaks, he'll be the first to turn his back on you. You don't know Michael. I know men. And I know that when it comes to real problems, most of them show their true colors." Dorothy headed for the stairs. "I'm going down to the guest room." "Dorothy." Her husband's voice stopped her. "Think about it carefully. Tomorrow morning you can apologize. We'll forget this conversation, and life will go on as before. Or what? Or you'll regret your choice for the rest of your life." There was nothing ambiguous about the threat. That night, Dorothy lay on the sofa in the guest room, staring at the ceiling. David was walking upstairs, his heavy, measured steps echoing in the bedroom. She knew those steps. That was how he walked when he was preparing a sermon or thinking about an important decision. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the footsteps stopped, but Dorothy couldn't fall asleep. In his apartment, Michael sat in the kitchen with a bottle of whiskey. He understood from his conversation with David that everything had been revealed. Tomorrow, his life would change forever. Either he would find the courage to fight for his love, or he would lose Dorothy and the only friend he had left. Detective Lisa Hernandez worked late, studying the case files. But from time to time, her thoughts returned to Reverend Clark and his strange reaction to questions about his wife. Her professional intuition told her that something serious was brewing in this family. And the snow continued to fall, covering Lexington with a white blanket that hid secrets and passions, ready to explode with renewed force. Thursday, November 16th, 6:47 a.m. Dorothy woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. David was already up and getting ready for his morning prayers, a habit he never broke, even on the hardest days. She lay on the sofa in the guest room, feeling exhausted after a sleepless night. Outside, the snow continued to fall. White flakes drifted softly to the ground, creating a deceptive impression of peace and tranquility. But inside the house on Hampton Street, the atmosphere was tense. Dorothy got up, wrapped herself in a robe, and headed for the kitchen. David was already sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and a Bible. When she appeared, he looked up at her with cold, searching eyes. "Did you sleep well?" he asked with a hint of irony. "David, we need to talk." "About what?" She sat down across from him, gathering her courage. All night she had thought about their conversation, about her life, about what she really wanted to change. "I want a divorce." The words hung in the air. David slowly closed the Bible, never taking his eyes off her. "Divorce," he repeated quietly. "Yes, we're both unhappy. There's no point in continuing this mockery of a marriage." "Mockery?" He stood up from the table. 20 years of marriage, and you call it mockery. "David, please, let's be honest with each other. We haven't loved each other for many years. You know that as well as I do." "Love in marriage isn't a feeling, Dorothy. It's a choice, a commitment, and I choose happiness. With Michael." The venom was palpable in her voice. "Maybe." David walked around the table and stopped beside her chair. "Do you realize what you're destroying? My career, our family's reputation, the church's authority? That's not my problem." "Not yours?" He grabbed her by the shoulder. "You're my wife." "Not anymore." Dorothy broke free from his grip. "And take your hands off me." Something changed in David's expression. The mask of civility slipped away, revealing the rage he had been holding back all night. "So, it's decided?" "Yes." "And you're going to him? To that loser who couldn't even keep his own family together?" "At least he knows how to love." The blow hit its mark. David paled, his hands clenching into fists. "And I don't know how?" "All you know is how to possess, to control, to use. I protected you." "From what? From happiness? From sin? From destruction?" Dorothy stood up, feeling a surge of determination. "David, our marriage was a sin. 20 years of lies, pretense, coldness." "Coldness?" He took a step closer to her. I gave you everything: a home, a position in society, respect. And love? Warmth? Understanding? You were my wife. What more did you want? To be a human being, not an accessory to your career. They stood face to face, and Dorothy saw something in his eyes that made her take a step back. David had always been a man with iron self-control, but now that control was cracking. Dorothy, his voice became quieter, more dangerous. If you leave, I'll ruin your life, and his too. How? I have connections in the school district. One word and you'll lose your job. And Michael's store is hanging on bank loans. One complaint to the tax office, one hint of financial irregularities. Are you threatening me? I'm explaining reality. Dorothy felt a surge of anger. So if I can't be happy with you, you won't let me be happy with anyone else? You're my wife, before God and man. No! She headed for the stairs. I'm filing for divorce today. Dorothy! He shouted after her. Don't do this! She stopped on the first step. Goodbye, David. If you go up those stairs and pack your things, there will be no coming back. Fine. What happened next took less than a minute. David caught up with her halfway down the stairs. You can't just walk out. I can and I will. Dorothy turned to him. I've been your property for 20 years, but not anymore. He pushed her. Not hard, just enough to stop her, to make her listen. But Dorothy was standing on a narrow step, lost her balance, and began to fall backward. Instinctively, she grabbed the railing, but her hand slipped. David lunged forward, trying to catch her, but it was too late. Dorothy fell, hitting her head on the edge of the marble step. There was a thud, then silence. David stood on the stairs, staring at his wife's motionless body at the bottom. A dark pool slowly spread out from under her head. Dorothy, he whispered. Dorothy. He ran down the stairs and knelt beside her. There was no pulse. Her eyes stared into the void. For a few seconds, David sat in a daze. Then reality hit him with full force. Dorothy was dead, his wife was dead, and he was to blame. His first thought was to call an ambulance. His fingers were already dialing the number when another thought popped into his head. What next? Questions, an investigation, scandal. The end of his career, disgrace, possibly prison. David looked at his wife, at the blood, at the stairs. An accident. Yes, it was an accident. She slipped on the wet steps. It had snowed yesterday. She could have brought moisture in on her shoes. She fell and hit her head. A tragic accident. He stood up, took a few steps back, and took out his phone. 911, what's happened? My wife fell down the stairs. I think she's dead. His voice sounded exactly as it should. Shocked, desperate, panicked. Sir, stay calm. Give me your address. David gave the address and answered the necessary questions. Then he sat down on the sofa in the living room and waited. The ambulance arrived 8 minutes later, followed by a police patrol car. David met them at the door, pretending to be a grief-stricken husband. Officer, thank God you're here. I found my wife at the bottom of the stairs. The paramedics quickly examined Dorothy and pronounced her dead. The police began to examine the scene. Mr. Clark, said Sergeant Thomas, an elderly police officer with tired eyes. Tell us what happened. I was in my study, getting ready for the morning service. I heard a sound, as if something had fallen. I went out and found her. David spoke with difficulty, like a man in shock. She must have slipped. It snowed yesterday. The steps could have been wet. I see. Did you hear her fall? Did she scream? No, nothing. If I had, I would have come running right away. The sergeant wrote down his statement, glancing at the stairs from time to time. Tell me, Mr. Clark, did your wife have any problems with coordination? Dizziness? No, never. She was always very careful. Half an hour later, Detective Lisa Hernandez arrived. Having received a report of the death of the wife of Reverend Clark, who had come to her twice with information, she decided to personally inspect the scene. Detective Hernandez, she introduced herself to David. My condolences. Thank you. He looked older, broken. I still can't believe this happened. Lisa carefully examined the stairs, the body, the blood spatters. Something about the scene bothered her. Mr. Clark, can you show me exactly where you were when you heard the noise? David led her to the study on the second floor. Here, I was sitting at my desk reading the Bible. And what exactly did you hear? A loud thud. I thought Dorothy had dropped something in the kitchen. Lisa nodded, but mentally noted that the stairs were not visible from the study. If Dorothy had screamed as she fell, he would have heard her. Did your wife often get up that early? Usually, yes. She left for work early. And was she already dressed? No, she was in her robe, probably going down to have breakfast. The detective wrote this down in her notebook. Mr. Clark, I know this is a difficult time, but I need to ask you a few more questions. Of course. How is your relationship with your wife lately? David hesitated for a moment. Good. We were a strong family. No problems? No arguments? No, nothing serious. Just the usual family stuff. Lisa saw his face tense up. Her professional experience told her that he was lying. The examination of the crime scene continued for 2 hours. The forensic team took photographs, collected blood samples, and measured the angles of impact. At first glance, it looked like an accident, but Lisa wasn't rushing to conclusions. Detective, a forensic technician approached her. Something strange here. What exactly? Look at the blood spatters. They're not where they should be if she fell normally from the stairs. Lisa studied the marks carefully. Explain. When someone falls backward, the blood should spray in the direction of the body's movement. But here, some of the spatters are facing forward, toward the stairs. It's as if she fell forward first and then rolled back. Or as if someone was standing nearby when she fell. The technician nodded. Possible. By noon, Dorothy's body had been taken to the morgue, and the house was empty. David sat in the living room, accepting condolences from parishioners and friends who had already heard about the tragedy. He played the role of the grief-stricken widower flawlessly. Dave, Michael arrived, pale and shaken. I just found out, I can't believe it. David looked up at his friend, his eyes red from crying, filled with grief. Mike, she's gone. Michael sat down next to him and put his hand on the pastor's shoulder. What happened? She fell down the stairs. An accident. I didn't even have time to help her. There was so much pain in David's voice that Michael felt a pang of guilt. How could he have wanted this man's wife? How could he betray his friendship? Dave, if you need anything, funeral arrangements, church matters. Thanks, friend. I don't know what I'd do without you. At the police station, Lisa Hernandez studied the preliminary report from the forensic team. Officially, it was an accident. But the more she thought about David Clark's behavior, the more doubts she had. She picked up the phone and dialed the coroner's number. Doc, it's Hernandez. Regarding the Dorothy Clark case, I need a full autopsy. Lisa, it's an accident. Maybe, but I want to be sure. Pay special attention to the injuries and check for signs of a struggle. Hanging up, Lisa opened a new file and wrote on the cover, Dorothy Clark death case, suspected homicide. Her intuition rarely failed her, and right now, it was screaming that Reverend David Clark was hiding the truth about his wife's death. By evening, members of the church council, neighbors, and friends had gathered at the Clark's house. Everyone offered their condolences and help. David received them with the dignity of a man who was grief-stricken, but not broken. Brothers and sisters, he said to the gathering, thank you for your support. Dorothy has gone to be with the Lord, but her memory will live on in our hearts. Michael stood in the corner of the living room, feeling like a hypocrite. He mourned Dorothy, but he couldn't openly show the depth of his feelings. To everyone else, he was just an old friend of the family. The service will be held on Saturday, David continued. Dorothy always said she didn't want a long goodbye. At the morgue, Dr. Richard Cole was performing an autopsy on Dorothy Clark's body. What he found made him frown. The head injury was indeed fatal, but on the wrists and shoulders of the deceased, he found fresh bruises, traces of strong fingers. Someone had held Dorothy Clark before she fell. Friday, November 17th, 9:15 a.m. Detective Lisa Hernandez studied the coroner's report with growing certainty about her suspicions. Dr. Richard Cole laid out the photographs in front of her, which told a story far darker than an accident. The bruises on Dorothy's wrists had clear fingerprints. On her left shoulder was a thumbprint from a strong push. Dark blue fibers from high-quality wool fabric were found under the victim's fingernails. Everything pointed to someone holding the woman and then pushing her down the stairs. Lisa took the forensic evidence and headed for Captain Rogers. The elderly police officer studied the photos and the report carefully, frowning from time to time. After receiving permission to investigate, the detective drove to the Clarks' house. Several cars were parked in the driveway. Parishioners were still arriving to offer their condolences. She waited for the last visitors to leave and approached the door. David greeted her looking like the perfect grieving widower, pale, with deep circles under his eyes and slumped shoulders. Every detail of his appearance spoke of inconsolable grief. In the living room, surrounded by floral arrangements from mourners, Lisa began her questioning. She methodically pieced together the details of Thursday morning, noting every inconsistency in the pastor's story. David claimed that he had not spoken to his wife that morning, that he had been in his study on the second floor, and that he had been wearing a dark blue suit. When the detective asked to see the suit, a small tear was found on the sleeve of the jacket. David's explanation that he could have caught it while checking his wife's pulse did not match the location of the tear. Gradually, family problems came to light. David reluctantly admitted that he and his wife had been having problems, and that Dorothy had been sleeping in the guest room. When Lisa reported the autopsy results, which showed signs of a struggle, the pastor turned pale and demanded a lawyer. The next stop was Michael Thompson's store. The owner looked depressed and was working through the pain. When Dorothy's name was mentioned, pain appeared in his eyes, which he tried to hide. Michael was cautious at first, offering general comments about the tragedy. But when Lisa hinted that the death might not have been accidental, his composure collapsed. He told her about Dorothy's unhappy marriage, David's controlling behavior, and how the pastor monitored his wife's every move. The most painful part was the confession of their mutual feelings. With tears in his eyes, Michael told how they had fallen in love, how Dorothy dreamed of escaping the golden cage of her marriage. He confirmed that David suspected their relationship and threatened to ruin both their lives if the truth came out. The picture of the crime became clearer. The motive was jealousy and a desire to preserve his reputation. The opportunity was that the couple lived in the same house. The evidence was bruises on the victim's body, fibers under her fingernails, and damage to the suspect's suit. By evening, Lisa had devised a plan to expose the truth. She decided to use Dorothy's funeral, scheduled for Saturday. The emotional tension and publicity of the moment could cause the killer to make a mistake. Saturday, November 18th. The Baptist church on Nicholasville Road was packed. Dorothy was loved in the community for her kindness and sincerity. David stood by the coffin, accepting condolences and displaying exemplary fortitude in the face of grief. Lisa watched him from the back row, noting every detail of his behavior. Michael sat next to her, pale and focused. To those around him, he was just an old friend of the family, but the detective saw the true depth of his suffering. After the service, when most of the people had left, Lisa approached David. She praised the beauty of the ceremony, and then told him about a witness who had come forward, a neighbor who claimed to have heard screams coming from the Clarks' house on Thursday morning. It was a bluff, but the pastor's reaction was telling. He turned pale, his hands trembled, and his voice faltered. Lisa added fabricated details about fresh fingerprints on the stair railing, positioned as if he had been standing above his wife when she fell. Under the pressure of mounting evidence and false testimony, David's self-control finally collapsed. He sank to a church pew and uttered the fateful words that he didn't want to kill her. Upon receiving this confession, Lisa turned on the tape recorder and listened to the full story of the crime. David recounted his last argument with his wife, her intention to file for divorce for Michael's sake, and his desire to stop her at any cost. He described how he grabbed Dorothy by the arms, trying to make her listen to him, how he pushed her in a fit of rage when she said she hated him. After his wife fell, the pastor panicked and decided to stage an accident. He knew that the truth about the premeditated murder would mean the end of his career, his reputation, and his freedom. David Clark's arrest came as a shock to the Lexington religious community. The man who had been trusted as a spiritual mentor turned out to be a cold-blooded killer. The church council convened an emergency meeting to decide on a temporary replacement for the pastor. Michael arrived at the police station in the evening. when news of the arrest had already spread throughout the city. He found it hard to believe that his best friend since childhood was capable of murder. The detective explained to him that David was solely responsible for Dorothy's death. The woman had the right to choose her own fate, and her husband had no right to take that choice away from her. The investigation was quickly concluded thanks to the defendant's full confession. David described in detail the events of Thursday morning, without trying to hide any details or shift the blame onto anyone else. The only thing he did not express was remorse. The pastor regretted only that his plan to stage the crime had failed. David Clark's trial took place 3 months later. The trial attracted statewide attention. Murders among religious leaders were rare. After hearing testimony from witnesses and experts, the jury unanimously found the defendant guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, was met with public approval. Justice had been served, but the price was too high. Michael was unable to remain in Lexington after the trial. Too many memories of Dorothy were tied to the town. He sold the store and moved to Colorado to be with his children, hoping to start a new life far from the tragedy. The Clark family's story served as a warning to many married couples in Lexington. It showed how jealousy and the desire to control a loved one can lead to irreparable consequences. Dorothy Clark did not die at the hands of a stranger, but at the hands of a man who promised to love and protect her until the end of her days. The case was closed, but its lessons remain relevant for anyone facing problems in their family relationships. Love cannot exist without freedom of choice, and marriage should not become a prison for one of the spouses.